Welcome to Western Region Pastoral Institute. This is Old Testament lecture number 1, Introduction and an Overview of Israel's History. So, as I explained in our first meeting, the lectures will cover more of a survey style approach to the text. Your reading is what we call introduction, which is a little more technical, dealing with the different books, authorship, background, and elements that are important for each of those books. And today we'll start with a focus on time, some chronology, and some context for the big picture. You can divide Israel's history into 7 different periods. The first period would go from the patriarchs, or would be called the patriarchal, and would go from Abraham to Jacob's 12 sons. Typically would cover the book of Genesis. Prior to Abraham, you have the early history, primordial. Sometimes it's referred to as primordial. But the patriarchal period would run from Abraham to Jacob's 12 sons. So the key people in this era would be Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel. Lot would be a key figure. Melchizedek would be a key figure. The 12 sons, which eventually become the 12 tribes, would be key figures. And then the bulk of the latter part of the book of Genesis, or the patriarchal period, focuses on Joseph and then introduces us to Egypt. Some of the key places in this period of time would be Ur of the Chaldees. That would be Abraham's hometown. We also have Canaan, the land of Canaan, where he comes, Palestine, that area, and Bethel would be a key city that occurs several times in this period of time. Bethel meaning the house of God. Key events in this period of time, the patriarchal, would be Abraham's call, covenant that God makes with Abraham, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the birth of Isaac in particular. The other key story surrounding Isaac would be Abraham taking him to Mount Moriah for the sacrifice and God's intervention there. The selling of Joseph into slavery and the rise of Joseph in Egypt. So that would be our first period of Israel's history, the patriarchal. The second period of Israel's history could also be called Egyptian, covers the time of their sojourn in Egypt and extends all the way to the Exodus. I would basically call this period the book of Exodus. That would be the period of time that's there. So here you have the key people are Moses and Aaron, Miriam, Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, Zipporah was Moses' wife. We're introduced to Yahweh, God as Yahweh. And finally, I think Joshua would be the final personage that you'd want to pay attention to in this part of the story. Key places would be Egypt, within Egypt, the land of Goshen, which is where the nation of Israel resided while they were in Egypt. Then you have the context, or the place where the wilderness wanderings will be, and where we begin to see Israel going to in the end of the Exodus, which would be Sinai and Midian. The key events would be the birth of Moses, the burning bush, Moses and Aaron confronting Pharaoh with the plagues, the Passover, the Red Sea crossing, the 10 Commandments, the story of the golden calf, and finally the instructions and the follow through on the tabernacle construction. So that would be the Egyptian period. So we have the patriarchal period and the Egyptian period. The next period would be the wilderness wanderings and the conquest. So here you have key people in this part of the story would be Moses still, Joshua, Caleb, Aaron, Korah, Balaam, and Rahab would be some of the key figures. The key places would be the wilderness. They spent the most of their time in wandering, the Sinai area, and the area south of modern-day Palestine, Israel. Canaan, the promised land, the destination for the nation. The two first cities of conquest would be Jericho and Ai. And again, finally, the conquest really culminates in the creation of the nation, the geographical area known as Israel. Key events would be the spies' entry into the land and their report back to the people. The crossing of the Jordan into Canaan would be a key period, a key event. The destruction of Jericho and Ai, and then the consequent battles with the inhabitants of Canaan. So that would be the third period, wilderness to conquest. The fourth period would be the period of the judges, and the key people in this period of time would be Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Samson, and then finally the transitional person in this judges period would be Samuel. Key places, most of the Judges, book of Judges occurs simply in the nation of Israel. And the key events would be the establishment of the office of judge, and then the birth of Samuel and the placement of Samuel in Eli's care as he becomes the prophet judge and the transitional person into the fifth period of Israel's history, the period of the kingdom. So the kingdom has Samuel as that transitional person, and then you have the kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, and then some key other personages, Jonathan, Goliath, Bathsheba, Nathan, and others. This is a very lively period of Israel's history, and there's lots of information and personages. The key places would be Jerusalem and its beginnings as the city of David. This is when Jerusalem really kind of gets its founding and early growth period and establishment as the capital and the place where Solomon will eventually build the temple. In this period of time, we also are introduced to the Philistines, lots of battles with the Philistines. The Philistines occupied what is modern day Gaza. And then there's a lot of a focus on the Judean wilderness. David spends a lot of time there. Key events would be the demand for a king, the enthronement of Saul, the initial king, the first king of Israel, the story of David and Goliath, David's placement in Saul's court, David's friendship with Jonathan, and the building of the temple. All of these would be the key events in this fifth period of the kingdom. Upon the conclusion of Solomon's reign, we enter into the divided kingdom. And the divided kingdom initially begins with two of the sons of Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And the kingdom is divided into north and south. The southern kingdom would be known as Judah. The northern kingdom would be known as Israel. We have Ahab, Elijah, and Elisha are during this period. Hezekiah is during this period. Josiah is during this period. Isaiah is during this period. And then also Jezebel would be in this period. Key places really, again, because of the division of the kingdom, you have Jerusalem as the capital of Judah, and Samaria and Shechem being the key cities in Israel. The key events, along with some dates, would be the Assyrian captivity of Israel, 722 BC, and the Babylonian captivity of Judah, along with the destruction of the temple and city in 586 BC. Now, just a pause here before we get into the very last period of Israel's history. You notice those are the first two dates that I've shared as we walk through this, these different periods of Israel's history. The dating of these events in the Old Testament is sketchy at best. Probably the first date that is fairly concrete in this in Israel's history would be the dating of the kings, primarily the date of Solomon. So Solomon is typically dated in 970, right around 970 BC. And once you go beyond the kings and you start moving backwards, there's some markers there, but there's a lot of conversation and dispute about the dates prior to Solomon. One of the popular dates that's bandied about in Christian circles is the date 4004 BC, which a gentleman named Bishop Ussher postulated was the dating for Adam and Eve, or the beginning of creation. And that date is purely a date that has been constructed on his evaluation of genealogies in the Old Testament and trying to construct a timeline going backwards using those genealogies. Most scholars see this process as not a reliable way to arrive at dates. The genealogies were not always fully complete. Oftentimes they skipped generations. Grandfathers and great-grandfathers were referred to as those who begat their grandchildren. It was just a common practice, but it's very difficult to ascertain with any certainty which of those are connected directly and where there might be any potential gaps. So that date of 4004 BC is not viewed with any certainty or referred to by scholars as anything that has a solid reference point. So we really don't refer to that date and use it as authoritative. All right, so the Babylonian captivity in 586 would be a key date in the nation of Israel's history and in our understanding of history, and it forms the transition into the last section of Israel's history, at least biblical history, and that would be the exilic and post-exilic periods of time in the nation of Israel. So the key people in this period of time would be Daniel, Nehemiah, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, and Cyrus, key kings that were mentioned in the book of Daniel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah. Key places would be Babylon. That would be the destination for the exile. Many of our reference points here have to do with the Babylonian exile and the relationship of the nation to Babylon in this period of time. And then the key events would be the return from exile under Ezra and Nehemiah, the beginning of the reconstruction of the city wall in Jerusalem, and the temple. So that would be the 7 periods of Israel's biblical history. There's one more section of history that precedes the New Testament. It would be called the Intertestamental Period. I didn't include it in the 7 historical periods because those were periods of biblical Israel. And in this intertestamental period, we don't have any scriptural evidence or records. We do have apocryphal references, and this is the period of time from where we get the Apocrypha. So the apocryphal books occur in this in-between period between the Old and the New Testament. Key people in this period of time would be Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabees, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the rise of Rome, or the Romans. Caesar Augustus would be the key person there, and this would be a time of preparation and development for the New Testament. The key events would be the battle over Israel between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, known as the Syrian Wars. And the Seleucids were the victors of that, and they generally ruled over Israel during this intertestamental period until the rise of Rome and their conquest of Palestine in the very end of the BC era, just prior to the coming of Christ. So Caesar Augustus was in the hundreds, and so that would be the beginning of that transition period from a Greek rule in this intertestamental period under the greater rule of Alexander the Great, and then the transition to the Roman rule of Palestine. Another key event in this period of time would be the Maccabean revolt and the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. All right, so there you have it. Those are the key and relevant historical periods for biblical Israel. When you look at the Old Testament as a whole, it's one of those exercises that you have a lot of variation on, but lots of people like to give kind of a basic flow of thought to the Old Testament. Some of the biblical or Old Testament theologies look for a unifying theme or a central theme. One of the ways to look at the Old Testament is divided into three basic categories of thought. This is separate from historical view, but you might look at one part of, or one thrust of the Old Testament as being God's promise to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations would be blessed. And so you find the purpose for the founding of the nation of Israel in this Abrahamic covenant. The second emphasis of the Old Testament is the covenant of God with that nation, and that is basically mediated through Moses. So you have the law and the priesthood mediated through Moses. And then finally, you could see another thread, and that would be God's promise to David. So you could see the Old Testament as being encapsulated or summarized in these engagements of God with these three key figures in the Old Testament. The relationship of God with Abraham, the relationship of God with Moses, and the relationship of God with David. And that would be the kingdom orientation. So those would be three ways to look or to categorize the Old Testament in some of maybe a thematic or relational way. One last thing for this particular lecture. I think maybe along the way what I'll do is throw out some provocative, or I find them provocative, ideas or ways of looking at the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. And one of the interesting ramifications of that is that when we mostly read the book of the Bible in English, we get a little bit of a different flavor for words and concepts and ideas. So for instance, most people would answer the question, when did the church begin? Most English readers would answer that question on the day of Pentecost. Church began on the day of Pentecost. Before that, you had the nation of Israel, and that was the category or the group of people that God dealt with. But in the Old Testament, in the book of, well, the first reference would be in Genesis chapter 28. We have this word that appears to describe the people of God, or the group of people who called themselves God. It's the Hebrew word kahal. Now, the Hebrew word kahal means assembly or congregation. And as I mentioned the first time, that it appears in the Old Testament is in Genesis chapter 28. verse 3 that reads, "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples." Now, this is a blessing that's conveyed upon Jacob. It is Isaac's blessing upon Jacob. And he uses the word kahal to talk about a company of peoples that would come from Jacob or from Israel. Now, in the late part of BC, and I think it's the hundreds, I should actually get my dates straight, but you can look it up if you like. 70 Jewish scholars gathered together and for the first time made a translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, into Greek. They called it the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, was widely used by New Testament authors. They quoted from it, they were familiar with it, and they used it. And in the Septuagint, there are two words that are used to translate the word kahal. The first word that's used primarily in the early part of the translation, which is an interesting insight to go with our source criticism, consistently translated kahal, synagogue. In Deuteronomy, the word is consistently translated with the Greek word ekklesia. So, for instance, if you look at Deuteronomy 4:10, it says, "Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, 'Assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children.'" Well, the word kahal is the word assemble in that verse, "assemble the people to me." And here, instead of synagogue, the word ekklesia is used. So it's the word that we understand, or we typically translate church. So if I'm a Greek reader of the Bible, I would have been introduced to the word church in relationship to the people of God at a much earlier period of time in my Bible reading. If I read the Greek Old Testament, the word there would be church. And so it wouldn't be foreign. And as a Greek reader, even a modern Greek reader of the Old Testament, if you had asked me, when does the church begin, it would have a totally different, it would get a totally different response from me, because I would be familiar with that word being used in the Old Testament. So for instance, if you turn to Joel chapter 2 and verse 16, it says this: "Gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and the nursing infants, let the bridegroom come out of his room and the bride out of her bridal chamber." So the word in the New American Standard, sanctify the congregation, congregation is translated by the New Testament translators, or the word kahal is translated as congregation. It's translated by the Septuagint authors as ekklesia, or church. So the Greek would read, "Gather the people, sanctify the church." So just an interesting tidbit for you about the difference between Hebrew words or the translation of Hebrew words from Hebrew into Greek and Hebrew into English, and the meaning of those words as we go along. Just an interesting tidbit for what it's worth. And get your reading done, and that'll do it for this lecture.